The grand hall of the Exodus was a sight to behold, a massive ship built by the combined efforts of many species, floating silently in the vastness of space. The walls, made of shining metallic panels, reflected the light of distant stars, casting an eerie glow across the room. A long table stretched across the center, filled with platters of exotic foods from various planets, and the air buzzed with the quiet murmur of diplomats and military officers, all dressed in their finest uniforms. It was a day of great importance. This was the first time the newly formed Terran coalition was meeting with the Xerothean Empire, one of the most powerful races in the galaxy. The Xerotheans were known for their strength and advanced technology. Their ships feared throughout the cosmos. They ruled their empire with an iron fist, and their queen, Salira, was a being of legend. It was said that she could control the very elements, bend the forces of nature to her will, and none who crossed her ever lived to tell the tale. Captain Ethan Price stood near the entrance of the hall, his sharp eyes scanning the room. His job was simple: protect the human delegation, ensure that the talks went smoothly, and watch for any signs of trouble. He had seen his share of alien politics, but there was something different about this meeting. Something was off, and he couldn't put his finger on it. He had dealt with the Zorathians before, but never with Queen Salira. This was a high-stakes encounter, and he wasn't taking any chances. The door to the hall opened with a soft hiss, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. Queen Salira stepped inside, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She was tall and graceful, her skin a deep shade of purple, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Her long, silver hair flowed behind her like a living thing, and her regal cloak, adorned with gold and precious stones, swept the floor as she moved. The Zorathian warriors who accompanied her stood like statues, silent and imposing. The murmurs of the crowd died down as she moved toward the head of the table. The queen's gaze swept over the gathering, taking in the assembled leaders with a quiet, calculating look. She knew the power she held, and she was not afraid to show it. Captain Price watched from the back of the room. He was used to seeing powerful figures, but there was something about Salira that unnerved him. She was more than just a ruler. She was a force of nature, a being capable of unimaginable power. He had heard the rumors, the stories of her ability to manipulate the elements, to control the weather with a mere thought. But there was something else about her that made Price uneasy. It was her hunger, her endless appetite for more. It wasn't just for power, though that too was immense. It was for something deeper, something darker. As the queen took her seat at the head of the table, a servant brought forward a dish unlike any other. It was a glowing, pulsating orb, its surface shimmering with an iridescent sheen. The other leaders in the room looked on with awe and curiosity, but Price's heart sank. He had seen that dish before, and he knew what it was capable of. It was a Zorathian delicacy, but it was far more than just food. The dish was known to be laced with a powerful energy, an energy that could freeze the very soul of whoever consumed it. "Do not eat," Price said, his voice steady but urgent. The room fell silent. The queen, her hand already reaching for the orb, froze mid-motion. Her eyes locked onto Price, a slight frown forming on her lips. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice smooth, but there was a sharpness to it that sent a chill down Price's spine. Price stepped forward, ignoring the subtle tension building in the room. "I said do not eat." "That dish? It's dangerous. It's not food, it's a trap." The queen's frown deepened, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The other diplomats and officers watched in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. Price's warning was bold, perhaps too bold, but he couldn't risk what he knew would happen if the queen consumed it. "That is an insult," the queen said coldly, her voice laced with venom. "You dare question my knowledge of my people's customs?" "I'm not questioning your customs," Price replied, keeping his voice calm and even.
"I'm warning you. That dish is not what you think it is.
I've seen it before, and I know what it can do. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The queen's eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, narrowed as she studied him. The tension in the hall grew thick, and the air seemed to freeze. "I have been alive for centuries," she said, her voice now icy. "You, a mere human, think you know what is best for me?" Price's jaw tightened. He knew this could go either way. If he pushed too far, it could result in a diplomatic disaster. But he had to make her listen. The stakes were too high. "Please," he said, his voice softening. "You may be centuries old, but that dish is not of your making. It is not a Zorathian delicacy. It's a weapon, one that will freeze you from the inside out." The queen stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, her hand withdrew from the dish. She sat back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Price.
"I will not be lectured by a human," she said, her voice filled with disdain.
"But I will listen. For now." Price let out a quiet breath of relief. It was a small victory, but it was enough. The queen had listened. But he knew this was far from over. There was something far more dangerous at play here, something that would unfold in the coming moments. As the queen nodded for the dish to be removed, a feeling of unease settled over the room. Price couldn't shake the feeling that he had just delayed something terrible. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it in his bones. Whatever was inside that dish, whatever dark energy it held, was not done yet. The queen's gaze turned to the other leaders in the room, and the atmosphere slowly began to return to normal. But Price remained on edge, watching the queen carefully, knowing that the real test was yet to come. The grand hall fell into an uneasy silence. Queen Selira sat at the head of the table, her regal presence undeniable. The moment was tense, everyone in the room still recovering from the captain's bold warning. Captain Ethan Price, standing at the edge of the gathering, could feel the weight of their gazes, but his attention was fixed solely on the queen. Her beauty, though commanding, was like a tempest. And Price knew better than most that it was not just the queen's power that made her dangerous. It was her pride. The Zorathian warriors behind her, large and silent, stood like statues, their eyes cold, observing the exchange. The other diplomats, leaders from many worlds, continued their quiet conversations, as if pretending nothing had just occurred. But Price knew the undercurrent of tension had shifted. The queen's pride had been pricked. And when you pricked the pride of someone as powerful as Selira, it could lead to more than just a diplomatic misunderstanding. It could lead to disaster. A servant entered from the side, carrying another platter. It was the same glowing dish, the one that had almost caused chaos moments ago. The soft hum from the dish, still warm and pulsing with an unnatural energy, seemed to vibrate through the air as it was set before the queen. Price's heart sank. The queen had done what he feared. She had dismissed his warning. And now, the dangerous dish was back. Selira's sharp gaze moved from the dish to Price, her eyes narrowing slightly. She could see his concern, but her pride would not let her back down. The queen's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, and she reached for the dish once again. The action was deliberate, as though she were daring him to stop her. "You believe you can stop me, human?" The queen's voice was soft, almost mocking.
"I am Queen Selira. You have no power here." Captain Price took a step forward, his mind racing.
He had to make her understand the danger. He had to stop her before it was too late. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, tugging at the back of his mind. The dish, the way it glowed, the way it hummed. There was an unnatural quality to it that went beyond its physical form.
He wasn't just concerned about the queen's well-being.
He was concerned about what the consumption of that dish could unleash. "You don't understand," Price said, his voice steady. "The moment you eat that, you will become its prisoner. The dish is designed to freeze your very essence, your mind, your body, everything you are. caught in a prison of ice. Queen Salira paused, her fingers hovering over the dish. She looked up at Price, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the two of them simply stared at each other, the air heavy with unspoken words. The room was still, no one daring to interrupt. The Queen's gaze softened for just a fraction of a second, and then, with a swift motion, she brought the dish to her lips. Price felt his heart race. Time seemed to slow as the Queen took the first bite. It was like watching a ship heading toward a storm, knowing there was no way to turn it around. He could feel the air around them growing colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. It wasn't just a chill, it was an unnatural biting cold, as though the very fabric of the room had shifted. "Your Majesty, please!" Price shouted, but his voice was barely audible over the strange hum that filled the hall. The dish's glow grew brighter, its pulse now a steady, rhythmic beat resonating deep within the walls. The freezing sensation spread quickly, creeping across the hall like an invisible force. The Queen's face, which had been calm and composed a moment ago, now betrayed a flicker of something else. Her eyes widened slightly, as though the first bite had awakened something inside her that she had not anticipated. She set the dish down, her hand trembling just slightly. The hall was getting colder, too cold for anyone to ignore. The warriors behind her stiffened, their usual composure cracking under the pressure of the unnatural chill. The temperature dropped further, and the walls seemed to creak, as if the ship itself was groaning under the weight of the freezing energy that was now taking hold. Captain Price felt it too. The room had transformed from a place of negotiation to a battlefield, but not one of weapons. The battle was invisible, a war of wills, and the Queen was losing. You are right," Queen Salira muttered, her voice shaky for the first time since entering the room. "What is happening?" Price's mind was already working, piecing together what he had feared. The dish wasn't just a food, it was a weapon, a dark creation designed to trap whoever ate it in a frozen state, their mind and body locked in a prison of ice. The fact that the Queen was experiencing this meant that the energy had already begun to take hold. The dish had been made for beings of immense power like her, but even she was not immune to its effects. "I warned you," Price said, his voice strained but steady. "This is the price of pride. The dish? It takes more than just your strength. It's after your essence, your soul." The Queen looked at him now, really looked at him. There was no mockery in her eyes now, no arrogance, just confusion and something that resembled fear. You knew?" she whispered. "I've seen it before," Price said. "I didn't know it would be you, but I've seen what this kind of energy does. It doesn't kill, but it doesn't let you live, either. It traps you in a state of frozen consciousness. You'll never escape." The Queen stood up, the freezing force tightening around her, her movements slower now, more deliberate. The once regal elegance of her form was slipping, replaced by a sense of struggle. It was as if she were wading through a deep, invisible snowstorm, every step more difficult than the last. Her warriors, those towering figures who had never shown fear before, began to shift uncomfortably. One of them stepped forward, his voice low and hesitant. "My Queen," he said, his voice strained. "What do we do? We have no control over this." Queen Salira's gaze flicked to her warrior, and for the first time, there was doubt in her eyes. She took a step back, clutching the side of the table for support as her strength seemed to leave her. She was losing her grip. And fast. Captain Price didn't waste another second. He had to act. He rushed forward, placing a hand on her arm.
You need to focus.
"You need to fight it, or you'll be lost forever." The Queen's eyes locked onto his, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Fight it?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "How do I fight it when I cannot even feel my own body?" Price knew that the Queen was powerful, far more powerful than most beings. But power alone would not save her now. The energy that had been unleashed by the dish was unlike anything anyone had ever encountered. It was a force that consumed, that locked down everything it touched. "You have to fight it with your mind," Price said. "Your willpower. Focus on your connection to your people, your empire. Focus on your strength, your essence." "Out, but I tell you, that is what will break this." For a moment the queen stood still, her face a mask of concentration. Then, slowly, she nodded, as if something in her had clicked. The energy around her seemed to shift slightly, the pulse of the freezing force weakening for just a moment. But it was not enough. The room was still freezing, the hum still present. It wasn't over. They were far from done. The queen, despite her strength, was not out of danger. The battle was far from won, and Captain Price knew that time was running out. They needed to act quickly before the queen became a permanent prisoner of the dish's magic. Captain Ethan Price could feel the temperature plummeting around him. The freezing energy from the dish was overwhelming, like a deep winter storm that had suddenly appeared in the heart of the hall. He looked around at the Zorathian warriors, their towering forms now stiff with cold, their faces blank. But it was the queen, Celira, who held his attention. Her regal composure was slipping, her strength faltering, and Price knew that if he did not act quickly, it would be too late. The queen's struggle was not one of physical strength. It was something deeper, something that had already begun to take hold of her mind. The energy from the dish had found its way into her very being, trapping her not just in her body, but in her thoughts. Price had seen this before, though not to this extent. This was no ordinary weapon. It was a form of psychic imprisonment, a force that drained its victim, locking them in a state of frozen awareness, unable to act or even escape. The queen took another step back, her hand still gripping the table for support. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling from the cold that seemed to consume her from the inside. Price could see it in her eyes. She was fighting, but she was losing. Her once powerful will, the thing that had made her a legend among her people, was being dulled, worn down by the cold, by the energy that had latched onto her. "You have to fight it!" Price urged, his voice rising with desperation. "Focus. You can't let it control you." Celira's eyes flicked to him, a moment of clarity flashing across her face. "I do not need your help, human," she said, her voice icy but strained. "I am the queen of the Zorathians." Her words faltered as her knees buckled beneath her. For the first time, Price saw a flicker of panic in her gaze. She struggled to stay upright, her body betraying her as the frozen energy spread further into her.
Price stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest.
Damned, he had to do something. He couldn't let the queen fall like this, not when he had warned her, not when there was still a chance to save her. "Queen Celira," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency, "listen to me. You're stronger than this. You have the power to break free, but you need to focus on yourself, your essence. Block out the cold. Focus on your mind, your will." Celira's gaze locked onto his, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The hum of the dish still echoed in the room, its energy swirling like a storm, but it was as if the queen could hear nothing else. Slowly, her eyes softened, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I will not fall," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I will not let this be the end." It was then that Price knew. He had to help her, but not with force, not with any weapon or technology. This was a battle of the mind. The queen, for all her power, had never encountered something like this, a force that preyed on the mind, not the body. And it was clear that her strength alone wasn't enough to fight it. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could fight it together. Price placed a hand on her arm, his touch gentle but firm. The cold was unbearable now, a chill that cut through his own body, but he fought against it. He knew the queen could feel it too. This wasn't just about her body, it was about her mind, her soul. The energy was trying to lock her in place, to freeze her in time, and if he didn't help her focus, it would succeed. "You are more than your power," Price said, his voice low but resolute.
You have the strength to resist.
"I know you do." The queen's eyes narrowed slightly as if considering his words. For a long moment she remained still, her body rigid with the cold that continued to grow stronger. But then something in her shifted. Slowly, her posture straightened. The trembling in her hands subsided, and the faintest flicker of warmth returned to her gaze. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if summoning all her energy, all her will to fight back. The cold had not disappeared, but it had become less suffocating. She had begun to focus, to resist, but Price knew that this wasn't something she could overcome alone. Not yet. They had to work together, using their combined strength to break the hold of the energy. Price took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had to do something that he wasn't sure would work. It was risky, but it was the only way. The queen might have immense power, but she was still being overwhelmed by the force of the dish. He had to guide her, help her focus her energy, her mind, on something beyond the freezing force that was threatening to consume her. "Think about your people," Price said, his voice calm but insistent. "Think about everything you fought for, your empire, your warriors, the thousands of lives you lead. Use that strength. Focus on them." The queen's eyes flicked open, and for the first time Price saw something else in them. Determination. She was no longer fighting against the cold. She was channeling her energy, her thoughts, into something greater than herself. Her mind was now focused on her empire, her people, the very essence of what made her who she was. Price could feel the shift in the air. The hum of the dish's energy began to waver, its pulse growing weaker. The freezing force that had gripped the queen's body slowly began to retreat, inch by inch. It wasn't over yet, but the queen was fighting back. She was using her strength, her willpower to break free from the icy grip that had threatened to take her. The Zarathian warriors, who had been standing in stunned silence, now moved forward, their expressions filled with both awe and concern. They had never seen their queen like this, vulnerable, struggling. But as the queen's energy began to return, so did their loyalty. They moved to support her, not in force, but in silent strength, standing by her side. The queen's breathing grew steadier, her body no longer trembling with cold. The energy that had frozen her began to loosen, like a tight grip being released. It was still there, still lurking, but it was no longer overpowering her. She had regained control, and with each passing second, the freezing energy weakened further. Price stepped back, giving her the space she needed. He had done what he could, but now it was up to her. She was the one who would have to break free, to take back the power that had been stolen from her. And he had no doubt that she would. Queen Salira was no ordinary ruler. She was a force of nature, and nothing could hold her down for long. Finally, with one last deep breath, the queen's eyes snapped open, and the cold that had gripped her body vanished. The room, which had been filled with an unnatural chill, now returned to its normal temperature. The hum from the dish fell silent, and the glowing light from the food dimmed, its power gone. The queen stood tall once more, her strength returning in waves. She looked at Price, and for the first time there was no disdain in her gaze, only respect. "You were right," she said, her voice steady though still laced with exhaustion. "I could not have done this alone. Thank you." Price gave a small nod, relief flooding through him. The battle was not over, but they had won this fight. The queen had fought back, and together they had stopped the dish's deadly grip from claiming her. But there was still much to be done. The Zarathians were a powerful people, and Price knew that their troubles had only just begun. The moment the cold had vanished, The tension in the room didn't immediately disappear. There was still an air of unease, like the calm before the storm. The Zorathian warriors, who had stood motionless during the entire ordeal, began to stir. Their faces, once frozen in stoic expressions, now showed signs of deep concern. The queen, standing tall and composed once again, had fought the freezing force back with every ounce of her strength, but even she knew that it wasn't over yet. The dish, the trap, still held a dangerous energy, and the hall, still charged with that ominous hum, was far from safe. Price glanced around the room. The diplomats who had witnessed the queen's struggle were watching with wide eyes. No one had expected things to unfold like this, and it was clear that the respect they once held for the Zorathian queen had shifted. She had been vulnerable, and in a galaxy where power was everything, vulnerability was a rare and dangerous thing to show. Price turned his gaze back to the queen. Her usual air of unshakable confidence had been replaced by something more human, something he hadn't expected to see in someone like her. But it was there, undeniable. Her strength had been tested, and for the first time, she had shown the cracks in her armor. Despite her power, she was not invincible. She took a deep breath, her shoulders squared, and walked to the head of the table. Her warriors followed her, their expressions tense. But they did not speak. The hum of the dish had faded, but the faint aftertaste of fear still lingered in the air. "I know what you are thinking," Queen Salira said, her voice steady, but the quiet exhaustion in her tone was apparent. "You wonder if I am still fit to lead. You wonder if my power has been diminished." She looked around at the gathered leaders, her eyes locking with each of them. "Let me assure you, nothing has changed. I am still the queen of the Zorathian Empire, and I will not be defeated by a mere dish." Her voice carried, as always, the weight of authority. But this time, something about it felt different. She wasn't speaking from a place of blind pride. She was speaking from a place of resolve, a place of survival. She had been tested, and now she was reminding everyone, and herself, who she was. Price watched her carefully. Despite the fierceness of her words, he could sense the cracks beneath the surface. She had been shaken, and no amount of pride could erase the memory of that vulnerability. He had seen it in her eyes, a flicker of doubt that had never been there before. The warriors behind her stood taller, their faces now reflecting a sense of unease. They had seen their queen brought to the edge, and they could no longer deny that she was not invincible. The power of the dish had cut through her, and while she had regained control, the experience had left its mark. "I owe you an apology," the queen said, her gaze now resting on Captain Price. "I underestimated you." "You were right to warn me." Price nodded, but he did not speak. He knew that the queen would not easily accept defeat, even if it was only a momentary one. It wasn't in her nature to admit weakness, but she had done so. He could see the shift in her eyes, the flicker of something softer, more human. It was a side of her that few had ever seen.
"We must leave this hall," the queen continued. "The dish's energy is not fully gone."
"It is still in the air, and if we remain here, we risk another attack. I will not allow any of you to fall victim to it." Price stepped forward, his mind racing. He had to act quickly. He could feel the pressure of time. The longer they stayed in the hall, the more likely it was that the dish's power would resurface. They needed to leave, but more than that, they needed to understand what had happened. What kind of energy had that dish contained? What had it done to the queen? And how could they stop it from happening again? "I agree," Price said, his voice calm. "But before we leave, we need to know more. We need to understand what that dish was and how it works. If we don't, we risk facing this again. And it won't just be the queen who suffers. It could be all of us." The queen glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "What do you suggest, human?" Her tone was cautious, but there was no more disdain in her voice. It had been replaced by curiosity. perhaps even a little trust. How do you propose we deal with this? Price hesitated. He had never imagined that he would be standing here, suggesting a solution to a problem involving the Zarathian queen. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. The queen had trusted him with her survival, and he could not afford to fail her. We need to get to the source of the energy, Price said. The dish itself is a weapon, but it's not just a simple trap. It's tied to something more powerful. I believe it's linked to the ancient energy fields that the Zarathians have been studying for centuries. If we can track it, we can find out how to stop it. The queen's eyes narrowed further. And you think you can help me with this? Price didn't hesitate. I do. But I can't do it alone. We need your help, Queen Salira. Without you, we don't stand a chance. There was a long pause. The queen studied him carefully, her sharp gaze searching for any hint of weakness in his words. She had been in control for so long that the idea of working alongside someone, especially a human, was likely a difficult one for her to accept. But the truth hung in the air. Undeniable. They needed each other. Finally, Salira spoke. Very well, she said, her voice firm.
You will have my help, but do not mistake this for weakness.
I still rule this empire, and I do not bend to anyone, not even you. Price nodded, knowing that this was the best he was going to get. He had earned her respect, but he had not yet earned her full trust. That would take time. Time that they didn't have. We need to act fast, Price said. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it becomes. The dish is only the beginning. There are greater forces at work here, and we need to find them before they find us. The queen regarded him for a moment longer, and then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. Her warriors followed her, their faces still tense but no longer as wary as before. Price followed behind, knowing that this was the beginning of something far greater than a simple diplomatic mission. They were no longer just negotiating, they were fighting for their lives. As they exited the hall, the cold that had once consumed them began to fade, replaced by a new sense of urgency. The queen was no longer just a ruler. She was an ally, and together they would face whatever threats lay ahead.